Hello there, I'm Sharon Blackie, and I'd like to tell you a little something about how I came to write my book, Foxfire Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women, which is a collection of reimagined fairy tales. Now, like many of you, I'm sure, I grew up on fairy tales. They were the first things I remember reading, and I gobbled them all down as quickly as I could when I was very young. I think in some ways it was probably, at the beginning, a need to escape from a fairly challenging childhood at times. But it soon grew into something more. It grew into an appreciation of the earthy, wild wisdom that seems to be captured in those stories, and all of the ways in which that wisdom can flow into our daily lives and teach us something about who we are in the world and how to be in the world. And as I grew older and began to study psychology and work with narrative psychology, I began to specialize in using fairy tales, as well as myths and other types of folk tales, in my clinical practice, because I found that they were so profoundly able to capture the imagination that people could almost couldn't help themselves transforming and changing if they really worked with them in a very, very deep way. And of course, all of those archetypal images and characters in fairy tales do very much unlock our imagination and, again, show us different ways of being in the world. So, fairy tales, by their very nature, also are shape-shifting creatures. They change over time because they're a kind of folk tale which very much reflect the customs and the conventions and the morals, if you like, of the society in which they emerge and in which they're told. And so fairy tales change over time. You can find, for example, in the classic fairy tales, Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, for example, that the very early versions of those stories are quite different from the later versions of those stories because, again, the tellings have changed as society develops and as ways of being in the world change, or accepted ways of being in the world change. And so it seemed to me, that many of the stories that I loved as a child hadn't really quite changed with the times. And of course some of them had, a lot of the process is a process of Disneyfication where you have exactly the same things happening. It's just that sometimes there are girls rather than boys in the heroic roles. But really the profound change that reflected a world that was seriously challenged in terms of the environment, in terms of the climate, that really reflected the profound cultural and social upheavals that we're going through. A lot of those fairy tales had not been transformed in those ways for contemporary life. So I set about thinking about how some of my favourite stories and some of my favourite characters might appear if those stories were told in the context of the difficulties and the challenges we find ourselves in today. So I started to wonder, for example, whether a character like the Snow Queen had any relevance to a world that was rapidly warming. I began to wonder what a kind of spiritual tourist might find if she found herself in Baba Yaga's cottage in the Russian woods trying to learn a shamanic version of shapeshifting. And so these kinds of questions were really the inspirations for the stories that I wrote. And the stories are all quite different. Some of them clearly are reimaginings of old stories, like the Snow Queen story. Some of them take characters, archetypal characters from old stories and fairy tales, like Baba Yaga, or like Ema and Fand in some of the old Irish stories. And they just ask the question of what would these characters look like if we imagined them in today's world rather than several hundred years ago. And for me, this isn't just an intellectual exercise. I believe that fairy tales, if told well, and if told in a relevant way, with relevant archetypes and characters and images, can really help us come to terms with the wildness that is both outside us and inside us. And a lot of the stories are about transformations or shape-shifting into animal form. And this, to me, reflects the importance of fairy tales in teaching us that animals often have a particular kind of wisdom that we humans do not have, and that sometimes, perhaps, we need to listen to. Sometimes we need to approach so that we can learn different ways of being, perhaps different ways of coming to approach the problems that face us today. If you would like to, you can, on this webpage, read a brief extract from one of the stories, and I hope that that will give you a flavour of the kind of things that I'm writing about. And if you decide that Foxfire Wolfskin is something that you'd like to read, then I very much hope you enjoy it.